and Joe Nye and distinguished colleagues who are here. I've been asked to talk about what we do about the broader future of the Asia-Pacific region, and specifically to talk about the possible long-term concept of an Asia-Pacific community. The reason I'm late tonight is that I've just been attending the graduating function for one of the classes sent here by the Organisation Department of the Chinese Communist Party, who have been here for the last 2 weeks. They saw Joe Nye earlier this afternoon and told me all sorts of good things that you had to say, Joe, and some of the bad things as well. Their evaluation of my performance in the same class was about of a similar time. But the reason I raise that is because the central part in the future regional equation is, of course, how China views its own future. And that was very much the subject of Joe's discussion with this very senior ministers from the party structure. And it has been a useful thing that Harvard University has been doing, not just with this group, but over many years now, 500 such people have gone through similar training courses at this great university. What I might do is simply talk to 4 points. The first is this, concerning what I think is the current state of the US-China relationship, which exists at the cockpit of the future stability. Then I might talk briefly about what can we learn in the centenary of World War I from the experience of the Europeans in the world about how to avoid unnecessary conflagration and conflict. And thirdly, I might talk about where East Asia has got to so far on the question of regional institutions. And then finally, some thought lines on this that I've had myself over the last several years, back to my period as Australian Prime Minister, about how we begin to change what the Chinese would describe as the sui, the pattern of thought about how we could construct a common future together. Let me start with the first, which is the current state of US-China relations. Joe has been looking at this for many years. I've been looking at this for many years. I've been looking at it primarily as either a diplomatic or political practitioner, himself as a distinguished scholar with a very significant reputation in China itself. My judgment is that the relationship at present is probably in its most difficult state that it's been in normalization. It should not be thus, for the simple reason that there are so many things in common between the two countries, but nonetheless it is thus when you start to talk to senior Chinese leaders and foreign policy leaders about the current state of the relationship. You can easily put together a list of what currently might be problematic in the relationship, but actually I think it's much more fundamental than that. It goes to both Chinese perceptions about their own and America's future in East Asia going out to the mid-century point, and America's perception of China doing the same. And reduced to its absolute essential, there is a high, profound, and I believe dangerous level of strategic mistrust between the two at this point. Of course, this is no one's fault in particular, it is a reality. And as someone from a third country, a friend of China and an ally of the United States, I've sought to bring a slightly different perspective on what could possibly be done about it. Which brings me to my second point. China, which is a deeply scholarly culture, spends a lot of time researching the rise and fall of great powers in history, not just in Asia but in Europe, and also patterns which emerge from historical analysis over time. For example, China in the last 10 years has produced this extraordinary series on Central Chinese television on the rise and fall of great powers. I think either an 8 or 12-part series, I can't remember whether it was 8 or 12, but quite a profound level of analysis as to why empires rise and why they fall. Starting with the Greeks and finishing with the British, and then to the present period, with a huge question mark about themselves in a country well known and loved by many of us around this table, namely the United States of America. And so when the Chinese look at historical evolution, they've been captured in part by the broadly called the Thucydides trap, whereby when an emerging power begins to challenge an established power, an established great power, then it creates a particular set of behaviours which are intrinsically destabilising, which produce two classical forms: either the emerging power seeking to preempt action against it by the established power, or by the established power seeking to rise of the emerging power by preempting first. The historical precedents given there are Athens and Sparta, and more recently, in the First World War period, Germany and Russia, Germany and Britain. The interesting conclusion that I draw from the First World War, which is, I think, shared by many Chinese scholars, is that how, in fact, can the Thucydides trap be avoided? Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has explicitly referred to this in his own speechmaking. That is, how do we escape necessarily the fault lines and the predictabilities and some of the verities of history and create a different future? His concept, which he describes as a new type of great power relationship, is a headline still waiting to be populated, but it is an explicit attempt to construct something different from the usual predictable great power clashes that we've seen littered across history. The study of World War I is particularly because the conclusions I draw from that, and that a number of Chinese scholars draw from that, but I'd be not truthful to say that it's widespread across the Chinese academy. So one of the reasons we had the events of 1914, one, not all, was the absence of any effective European-wide institution at that time. In fact, the systems of global dispute resolutions had barely begun through various international institutions established the previous year in The Hague. And we had not even begun to fashion the League of Nations, let alone the United Nations. But within Europe itself, and they took us into this war through all the historical factors we're familiar with, one of the great problems was frankly, the faulty nature of diplomatic communication at the time, and the absence of intermediating powers or institutions capable of ensuring that the communications were correct, accurate, and informed. I don't wish to misrepresent history. That's not the single causative power. But in the critical events of 1914 through August and into the early days of September, I think it was a significant contributing factor. Now, the Europeans on this question, and I hope I'm not offending anyone around the table, but I'm Australian, we do that professionally anyway, they're slow learners, and so we had a second great conflagration as well, called the Second World War. And eventually the Europeans concluded, particularly France and Germany, that this was a generally dumb idea. Having been through the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, and the Second World War, with the combined carnage approaching something in the vicinity of 50 million. I'm looking at Richard here to nod his head whether I've got the collective number right from those three conflagrations. And so statesmen after the First World War decided that European institutionalism would be a factor which would reduce the risk of such conflict in the future. If you look at the modest beginnings of what we call the European Union, and starting with the Coal and Steel Agreement of 1954, essentially a Franco-German agreement, to what then became a common market, which in turn became a European community and which ultimately became a European Union. The strategic objective which people like Adenauer and Schuman had at the time, I think was in time realized, and that is the thought now of France and Germany ever taking up arms against each other is now so out of the range of conceptual possibilities as to be ridiculous. If we asked that question in 1945, 1950, or even 1955, I think given we had so many repeat performances, that would not necessarily have been the feud. So I pay tribute to the statesmen of that period, from 45 to 55, France and Germany in particular, socialist and conservative. Which brings us to the question of the Asia-Pacific region and on the question of institutionalism. If you look at what's evolved in Europe since 1945 through European, let's call it pan-institutionalism, the European Union itself, the CSCE, ultimately becoming the OSCE, and various other Europe-wide institutions. The parallel developments in the Asia-Pacific region have been very thin to non-existent. If you look at our region, and when I say our, I mean Australia's region, we've seen the evolution of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, good in itself. The fact is that particular culture of regional institutionalism, it's turned former adversaries into, frankly, colleagues, but the possibility of the concept of large-scale war between them, that is the 10 Southeast Asian states, by and large is now much more remote than it ever was. But remember in 1975 when ASEAN was first conceived, or 76 if I'm correct, when it first became more fully formed, it actually dates from earlier exercises in the late 60s, it was seen then primarily as an anti-communist bloc by Western-leaning pro-military dictatorships against communist Indochina. But the development of concepts of community, of even common security community, I won't say common values because that overstretches it if you look at entities such as Indonesia, Singapore and Vietnam and Burma. It has been, I think, at a sub-regional level, quite a remarkably successful institution. Because since the fall of Saigon, leaving aside the border clash between Cambodia and Vietnam a couple of years later, amongst the Southeast Asians, it's been conflict-free. However, if we looked at the map more broadly across wider East Asia, institutionalism has frankly been much thinner on the ground. There evolved out of ASEAN something called the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is to have a loose dialogue on pan-regional security questions. That was an Australian diplomatic initiative from one of my predecessors, Gareth Evans. If you look at the evolution, in fact, beginning with the Chinese, of ASEAN +3 becoming ASEAN +6, and in turn becoming the East Asia Summit, which now includes the United States, you have the evolution of a thin institution, but nonetheless one which exists on paper. More broadly across the region, however, you have at an economic level APEC, again an Australian diplomatic initiative by Bob Hawke and later Paul Keating, which has had a huge role in, frankly, establishing as an orthodoxy within wider East Asia the necessity of having open economies and open markets in a region where that was not previously the orthodoxy. And I think APEC has been a very useful catalytic institution in that respect. But an integrated institution which embraces the political, foreign whole century, namely wider East Asia, including India, there isn't much to speak of. Which brings me to my final point. What then can be done? For some time, a bit like a voice in the wilderness, I have argued a proposition that we should begin thinking about, conceptualizing, and then advancing in practice the idea of an Asia-Pacific community. Its first stepping stone has already been established through some reasonable diplomacy, which I had a role in the lead up to 2010, which was finally getting the East Asian Summit partners to agree to America joining. And that was an administration decision then to accept that invitation in 2010, given historical patterns of US behavior in Asia was, we don't do multilateralism, you guys do that, we just do bilateral alliances. Some of us who were deep friends of America thought this was not entirely mindful of how the region would unfold over time. And I helped, I think, in my own way to lead that charge. Anyway, getting the 10 Southeast Asians, the 3 Northeast Asians, China, Korea, and Japan, and the 3 others, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, to agree to America entering this institution was a significant, as seen within the region, breakthrough. The interesting thing about the EAS, as it's called within East Asia, 2 advantages. One, it has an open mandate. If you look at its founding principles in 2005, it can address political, economic, security, foreign policy, and any other matter which leaders deem to be relevant to the region's future. It's called the Kuala Lumpur Declaration. The second thing is that for the first time we have a a nascent institution in Asia which has all the principles around the table. Because the great danger prior to that was that you'd have a bifurcated Pacific with simply the East Asians, grand regional institutions, and America carved out. But now you have America, and now you have the East Asians, and of course Russia is there as well. So what I've argued since 2008 on is that we should, over time, evolve a concept of an Asia-Pacific community. And I'm very mindful of European precedents here in simply taking things slowly, step by step. But the value of a galvanizing vision for the long term is it actually points political and strategic energies in a particular direction, even if you can't realize its immediate material manifestation at all levels. So, the fact that we have, through the East Asia Summit process, got the participants right and got the mandate right, now requires the next step, which is turning it into a more robust regional institution, and therefore evolving into something which I'd call an Asia-Pacific community. My final point is this. Partly this, I wish to be realist about this and say it doesn't fundamentally resolve realist strategic concerns either on the part of the Americans, or Chinese, or others within the region, in areas where at present there is no common strategic agreement. But what it does do is that it begins over time to create the culture of common security dialogue, common foreign policy discourse, common political conversation about the region's common future. And that, prior to 1954, didn't really exist in Europe. And I've got to say, when I look at that example, I look at what we could do in the Asia-Pacific, and frankly, it's capable, I think, of producing some genuine positive outcomes for the future. It is not a panacea. It is one part of a broader fabric in dealing with, I think, the current fragile and delicate and perhaps deteriorating state of the US-China relationship. And if we can have that as part of our armory and our software for the future, developing step by step a culture of strategic cooperation, beginning in such practical areas as common preparation and engagement for the next major natural disaster in East Asia, because we have them at a large scale every year, where all the militaries are working together, the PLA, USAF, and the rest, the Royal Australian Air Force and the Indonesians and whomever, and the Japanese Self-Defense Force, on the next big one, whether it's a Fukushima-type incident, whether it's an earthquake in Sichuan, or whether it's out-of-control fires in Australia, which take out a large city. This begins to create, shall I say, the culture, atmosphere, and spirit of common regional enterprise. So those are the thoughts I'd like to leave you with in particular this evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gavin. Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister.